Chapter 4, The Artificial Conscience. We are supposed to be living in a constitutional federal republic. We don't live in a democracy, or at least we aren't supposed to be living in a democracy. Democracy necessarily entails a rejection of constitutionalism. In a democracy, remember, it is contrary to the nature of a political body that the government, the sovereign, impose upon itself a law it could not break. So in essence, in a democracy, no laws are placed upon the governing body. No laws upon the governing body means no limits to its power. When Americans believe we live in a democracy, when our government officials forward this claim and act as though they are acting in accordance with the general will, when the media advance such a narrative, perception is reality. The government acts illegally outside the confines of the artificial conscience, and those in national office are rarely held accountable, are rarely treated equally under the law, and often act as though the law does not even apply to them as individuals or citizens. And this is why I will keep pounding the drum over and over and over and over and over and over and over. We should not be seeking to protect democracy. We should not be worried about threats to democracy. We should be wary of every comment that emphasizes the common good, the general welfare, the idea that elections have consequences. Instead, though, everyone has seemingly bought into the democracy narrative, and the American people have been okay with corruption in government as it is no longer seen as corruption. If it is my side perpetrating the crime or the corruption, if it is the side that the media defends perpetrating it, it's not corruption. Remember, there's no law the government cannot place upon itself that it cannot break in a democracy. Yet the Constitution is supposed to be constraining the powers of the government. The Constitution is supposed to protect the citizens of our country from the government. And that is why I first said in this chapter that democracy inherently entails a rejection of constitutionalism. So, maybe once in a while we rear our heads and say no one is above the law, but that cannot be further from the truth. The government officials are always operating above and outside the law, especially since we adopted this idea that we live in a democracy. Once we have a people who believe we live in a democracy and a ruling class that rules as though they are ruling a democracy, the law is moot. The Constitution is moot. Only whether or not you agree with the rulers, whether or not you agree with the media, whether or not you agree with the perceived majority, that's the only thing that matters now. Stop talking democracy. Start talking liberty. Stop talking democracy. Start talking constitutional federal republic. I know it takes much longer to say our constitutional federal republic than our democracy, but we should be defending our Constitution. We should be defending federalism. We should be concerned about threats to our Constitution. We should be concerned about threats to federalism. And yes, we should be concerned about threats to freedom, because the number one threat to our freedom is an unconstrained government, and they've come to this place in the United States because we have overwhelmingly agreed that we no longer live in a constitutional federal republic, but in a democracy. Okay, enough for now. Heading: Rejecting the prick of the conscience. Many argue that the revolutions Locke advocated for should happen through elections, and point to the pendulum swinging from left to right and back again as evidence that such revolutions indeed happen. But do these arcs of the pendulum seem revolutionary to the voters? Do they feel as though they are ousting a government that is corruptly taking their rights and instituting a new government that will protect their rights? Likewise, even if the revolutions Locke desired for society happened through elections, according to Jefferson, those governing should be reminded of the limits to their power through small rebellions every 19 to 20 years. So, should not those in power, if there truly was a revolution through elections, never last more than 20 years? When Americans keep electing the same politicians for 40 or 50 years and never completely turn over the federal bureaucracy, this goes against the intentions of the Constitution regarding the prevention of a permanent majority tyranny. Something I don't address very much in this book is the idea of lifelong bureaucrats. But there is so much that could be said here. Whether it was the State Department that negotiated the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the FBI or IRS going after citizens based on their ideological leanings, the FDA seeking to hide data from the public for 75 years, the chief administrators in any number of agencies or advisors working in collaboration with private entities before, during, and after their tenure in a certain administration. Or we could talk about regulators at the EPA or rule makers in the Social Security Administration. I mean, really, the list could go on and on and on. And this is why there are some people who talk about a fourth branch of government seeking to increase power onto themselves. There is no such fourth branch of government in the Constitution, though. The bureaucracy is supposedly part of the executive branch. However, when administrations change, the bureaucrats don't. Even if some heads of agencies change, very few changes occur in the middle management and rank and file civilian employees of the government. And there are a lot of them, millions of them. And we have become so accustomed to these government jobs, it seems kind of heartless to say just fire the lot of them. And we justify that because of all the expertise that would go out the door with them. But that knowledge base is also the base of power for this unconstitutional fourth branch of government. So even if the pendulum is swinging left to right and back again, the majority of representatives serve almost their entire lifetimes without any revolutionary replacement. So perhaps the political elite is itself attempting to consolidate power in a system that keeps them in power indefinitely, and lifelong bureaucrats abet in the perpetual pursuit for more power. Heading: Protections Circumvented. So now we are going to revisit all those constitutional elements that make up the artificial conscience we talked about in the last chapter. And we're going to look at just a few ways that they are and have been circumvented in recent years or days or decades. There are many, many others, but this is just to draw your attention to some examples or samples so you can see for yourself and maybe pick up on additional ones as you approach the current events and news cycle from a new perspective after reading this book. Republican government is not only undermined by lifelong politicians serving their own interests, but through the method those representatives are selected. To remain Republican, representation was to be geographic in nature. And while representatives for a particular state must be from a particular state or region, this geographic and temporary representation appears to be undermined by gerrymandering, where both major political parties seek to draw district lines to ensure the people likely to vote for their particular party will have a representative from their party for their district. Whereas this is often framed in a different light as a way to ensure minorities are represented in Congress, this is another example of political parties framing the elections and thus the debate around two opposing views instead of providing representation for an actual political minority to have a voice within Congress. Gerrymandering is a way to reinforce the power of those already in office, shore up the two major political parties, and thus maintain the division that leads to polarization and a belief in democracy. Separation of powers has been circumvented constitutionally via the 17th Amendment, as mentioned previously, which also serves to take powers away from the states, an attack on federalism. And continued attempts to consolidate bases of power appear each election cycle. As midterm elections are seen as a referendum on presidential approval, governor races are tied to Senate races, and the political pundits predict blue waves and red waves. Now, elections that should be focused on state and local issues are seen as nationwide mandates for centralized domestic policy. All government officials are seemingly beholden to all the same constituents. Even federal judges and U.S. Supreme Court justices have been politicized as the campaign for president, as well as for senators, has emphasized the importance of judicial appointments that align with the political leanings of a particular party or movement. We see this shift in politicizing the least dangerous branch of government as votes for confirmation of Supreme Court justices and federal judges have shifted from overwhelming support in the Senate to votes down party lines. And we also see the use of the judiciary to promote ideological policies, such as a prosecutor or litigant choosing a federal court they know will be more sympathetic to the position they wish to push onto the American public and then into societal norms. And so we see the separation of powers, not just power bases, being eroded as well. We'll address this more, I think, when we get to checks and balances. There is one apparent exception to this consolidation of bases of power, that of the Electoral College. And I think that is a good place to end this segment.